Evening, everybody, and welcome to this talk about the Beechworth Asylum. My name's Eileen. I'm a sociologist and genealogist, and I'm based in Albury. If you wish, you can use the chat function to tell us your name and your location. Before we go further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm now speaking from, the Wiradjuri, and the owners of the other lands around. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to introduce my two colleagues. Jenny Munday from Sturt University in Thaguna, and Alison Watts from Southern Cross University, and she's based in Lismore. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing for quite some years now, investigating the history and the background of the Beechworth Asylum and then Mayday Hills Psychiatric Hospital. We're going to talk a little bit about the exhibition that we've got running in Albury at the moment. As I go through, you'll notice that from time to time I use words like asylum and lunatic, but we really don't often use today, but we're using those to give a sense of the historical context in which our work was done. This talk's one of many activities that have been taking place across the country this week as part of Social Science Week. Social sciences include sociology, political science, economics, geography, and they're the science of how we live together as communities. And if we think about some of those things, they matter deeply to the quality of our lives, the fairness of our society. And we've used these insights in our work about Beechworth. So tonight, I'm going to outline 3 ways in which the Mayday Hills Asylum brought economic benefits to Beechworth. Alison will then talk about the social activities that she's been researching. And Jenny is going to give us a walkthrough of the exhibition and talk about some of the exhibits. We should have time at the end for some questions. So if you have any questions in mind as we go through, you can post them using the chat function. Beechworth Asylum, Mayday Hills Psychiatric Hospital brought economic benefits to Beechworth in 3 ways, at least. Through the provision of goods and services, through employment, and through tourism. Although at different times the benefits were not always immediately apparent. Let's start by looking at goods and services. In a modern, humane democracy, most citizens agree that facilities such as prisons, drug rehab centres, even garbage tips are a necessity and should be built. However, when plans for locating such facilities are mooted, self-interest comes to the fore. They should be built somewhere else, not in my town, my suburb, my street. Meetings are held, petitions raised, lengthy appeals are sent to planning tribunals like BCAT. So common is this that the term NIMBY, not in my backyard, was spawned to describe such actions. There's no record of such protests in Beechworth in 1862, when the idea of building a lunatic asylum was first raised. At that time, the only asylum in Victoria was Yarra Bend on the outskirts of Melbourne. It was overcrowded and insanitary. In country areas, those poor souls who were designated as lunatics were usually locked in the local prisons alongside criminals. If they were lucky, perhaps they might be transferred to Yarra Bend. So a government committee was convened, as they do, and it recommended that new asylums should be built in country areas, including Beechworth. We can see from the local paper that the local council thought this was an excellent idea. They cited humane grounds, although no doubt they had financial motives in mind also. The local newspaper endorsed the council's stand. Things moved quickly. Land was selected, plans drawn up. But if locals were hoping for an economic bonanza, they were disappointed at first. Tenders for construction were called for in late 1864. They had to be submitted within 10 days. Specifications were not sent to Beechworth, and local contractors were not invited to tender. Of course, this is a happening that we sometimes still hear from time to time, that the big guys out of town get all the good jobs in a country town. At Beechworth, Mr. Abraham Lineker of Carlton was the successful bidder, and it was estimated that the total cost would be over £100,000, a very substantial amount in those days. So work commenced, and any early disappointment among the locals was soon overcome. The huge building, 3 stories high and with 3 wings like an uppercase E, required a small army of labourers, and soon there were 250 men on site each week. No doubt the local pubs did a flourishing trade during the hot summer. The local paper even noted that many workers were attracted from Melbourne because of the high wages. As the building progressed, local businesses were contracted to do work on the site. In 1866, Mr. George Robinson of Beechworth won the very large contract to paint the new asylum. By mid-1867, the asylum was almost finished, and local merchants were contracted to provide meat, groceries, vegetables, and bread. On the 24th of October, 1867, 10 lunatics were transported through the town from the jail to the asylum, the first of thousands who would pass through its doors. In the years that followed, the local newspaper often carried reports of local businesses that were supplying goods and services to the asylum. Once the asylum was established, annual reports had to be written and sent to the Victorian Parliament, and these provided details of patients and the asylum's finances. For example, in 1889, there were 498 patients. Over £15,000 that had been spent in that one year on maintenance. And we imagine most of that would have gone to local businesses. Even £73 in allowances had been paid to local chaplains. And I guess that was more than what was taken up in the collections each Sunday. Over the years, more buildings were added as patient and staff numbers increased and therapeutic approaches changed. Small cottages were built in the grounds for harmless patients. An impressive residence was built for the medical superintendent in 1907. And in 1936, a large Art Deco building was constructed as the nurses' home. That's now been converted to the Lineker Hotel. All of these activities strengthen the links between the asylum and the town's building contractors and tradesmen. Let's move on and look at employment. If the town was hoping for a financial bonanza from the building of the asylum, there were probably similar high hopes for the number of jobs it would generate. Indeed, one of the often cited reasons for putting new asylums in gold mining towns like Beechworth, Ballarat, Ararat was to provide work for people who had flocked there in search of gold and who now were sitting around, no gold, no work. However, when the asylum was first opened, staff with some experience were needed. In October 1867, 12 staff were transferred from Yarra Bend. But once again, the local paper tells us that a local man was appointed as the head gardener. And I think anyone who's seen the grounds that were established would agree that he did a pretty good job. By 1870, 46 staff were required, mostly untrained warders and attendants. But these positions were hard to fill because of poor pay and conditions. Starting salary for men was £65 a year. For women, it was only £26 a year. Their working days started at 6 a.m. and went through to 10 p.m. and they were required to sleep in the wards. Married men were allowed to sleep at home on some nights, but the low pay and house rental of £24 a year meant that very few men could marry and support a family. These staff provided basic custody and care in the wards and worked alongside patients in gardens, workshop, laundry, kitchen, etc. Once again, we can look at the 1889 report to Parliament, where it was noted with concern that no cooks had yet been appointed. Warders were most dissatisfied with having to perform these duties, and the manner in which they did so demanded urgent attention for the well-being of staff and patients. It's not something you care to think about, probably. Let's fast forward to the middle of the 20th century. The asylum, now known as Mayday Hills, was a thriving community with large numbers of patients and staff. Senior staff and their families lived in the grounds. Some had trusted patients working in their homes as domestic servants. We've heard stories from people who lived on site as children, while other children would come up the hill after school to meet their parents who were working there. Seeing people with mental illness was a normal part of life for them, and it's not surprising that many ended up working there. A job at the asylum was well regarded, and like most public service jobs, there were good prospects for lifelong employment. Parents working at the asylum encouraged their children to apply. A couple of the former staff that we've spoke to told us words like, "You're getting married soon, son. Get yourself a solid job there. You'll be set up for life." The asylum now had a training school for its staff to become registered psychiatric nurses. Other nurses from across the state who were doing their general nursing training at hospitals were sent to Beechworth for a few months of specialised psychiatric nursing. Just about the whole population of Beechworth worked in one of its large institutions: the psychiatric hospital, the prison, or the old people's home. Shift work and caring for people on the fringes of society was a way of life until the 1980s, when the push to shut large institutions in favour of community care meant that the town had to reinvent itself. That's when tourism became important. Since the closure of Mayday Hills as an asylum, the site's undergone several changes of ownership, but the exteriors of many buildings and the grounds are substantially unchanged, and the site has become a tourist attraction. The Linacre Nurses' Home was refurbished into a 4-star hotel. The building once used for drug and alcohol rehabilitation is, ironically, now a bar and bistro. And there's a bed and breakfast in what was the gatehouse. Several different types of visitor come to this site, all of whom would spend a few dollars or more in the town. There are people interested in the history of Beechworth generally, and those looking for a quiet weekend in the country who might choose to stay on the site. Then there are those who come specifically to visit the asylum. There's a growing interest across the world in what is called dark tourism, visit to places like prisons and asylums that show what life and death was like for society's outcasts. At Mayday Hills, it's possible to have guided tours of some of the old buildings and to hear stories of patients and those who cared for them. Finally, there are people whose interest is deeply personal because family members were once patients in the asylum. They come to see how or where their relatives lived, perhaps to visit their graves in the cemetery. We spoke to one such family last year. They'd grown up in Melbourne. They knew that grandfather was in hospital. Every 6 months, Nana would make the long journey by train to Beechworth to visit him, although the children could never understand why Pop didn't get better and come home. He died in 1965 and was buried in Beechworth Cemetery in an unmarked grave. At some stage, the family visited the cemetery and left a small handwritten sign on the grave. From this, I was able to contact them last year and tell them that Veterans Affairs had now put a headstone on the grave, acknowledging their grandfather's war service in World War I. Last November, family members came to Beechworth for a weekend. We were privileged to meet them. They wanted to see his grave and photograph it and see what Beechworth was like. This was a tangible memory of the grandfather they barely knew, and his story is included in one of the exhibits in the exhibition. So, through goods and services, employment and tourism, Beechworth Asylum, Mayday Hills, has been a source of benefit to the town. My colleague Alison Watts will now talk about some of the social activities that she investigated. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Eileen. That was really interesting. So just to sort of reintroduce myself, my name's Alison Watts. I'm zooming in from Lismore in northern New South Wales, and I'm the Southern Cross University arm of our Beechworth Asylum group. So I've contributed 3 collections to the exhibition, and I'll just see if I can get my PowerPoint up to share with you. Okay, so there's 3 parts of the collection that I contributed to that's on at the Albury Library Museum. The Watts family research, the Donnan family research, and the new Open Door Patient magazine. So I'll just talk briefly about each contribution. Let's see, am I sharing that okay? That might be better. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so the first collection I contributed to the exhibition concerns Alison Watts. She's my grandmother and patient. So we learnt that Alba was hidden from the family for decades, and actually it was a family secret that Alba had spent most of her adult life in mental institutions. Alba lived at Mayday Hills as a patient in the 1950s and 60s, and as part of my PhD research, I'd accessed her mental patient files from the Freedom of Information Unit as a family member. I found that Alba was committed with the term puerperal insanity in 1936. This was following the birth of her second child, and she was suffering auditory hallucinations. Puerperal insanity is a 19th century psychiatric category that's no longer in use. Today, it might be considered postnatal depression or postnatal psychosis. Alba underwent a series of treatments at Mont Park in the 1940s, including insulin coma therapy, a therapeutic abortion, and sterilisation. However, none of these stopped her auditory hallucinations. By 1956, Alba was transferred to Beechworth Mental Hospital, later known as Mayday Hills. And it was by the 1960s that she was diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia and was prescribed medication for the first time. So on display in the exhibition is a 1-page from Alba's mental patient file, photographs and quotes from our family members. Alba's story doesn't end there. Further research took me onto the Donnan family, which at Beechworth, Alba, her files say that Alba identified as a worker and not a patient. This is probably because she lived in Dr. Donnan's home, the chief psychiatrist whose home was within the grounds of the hospital. Here, Alba worked as a domestic servant with Dr. Donnan's wife and caring for his two children, Karen and Nicolette. It was during my PhD research I managed to locate Karen, Dr. Donnan's daughter, who spent her childhood living at the mental hospital with her family. Karen was very generous with her time with me. I came to understand that Alba had experienced family life with the Donnans during her time as a patient at Beechworth. Karen has lent the exhibition many items and stories from her childhood at Mayday Hills. Of note is the ceramic figurines given to her and her sister by Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax. Dax was the head of the Mental Health Authority. He would visit, Karen told me, Dax would visit, play with the children, have dinner with the family, and then tour the hospital with Karen's father, Dr. Donnan. There's a couple of photographs there on that slide. A photograph of the superintendent's home on the grounds. Every superintendent actually could live in that home. And so the first photograph on that slide is from 1915 to 1922 from Dr. Caterinch. And the bottom one there is from Karen, a photograph of the home on the grounds in 1950s, where you can see Alba's room there at the end of the veranda. My final contribution to this exhibition is the Mayday Hills Patient magazine. Just a little bit about, production and so forth. Our research group managed to source, several copies of the Open Door magazine. We've got 6 copies from the 1960s and 50s to 60s on display in Albury, as well as a full copy of the centenary edition in 1967. That one's on lend from Burke Museum. The publication was part of occupational therapy program for patients. The style and format changed in 1960 to include a pledge, the table of contents, and listing patient Norman Colley as the commercial artist. The pledge is beautifully written. It reminds that last sentence in the pledge says, it reminds the reader to raise the dignity of the human individual and our fellow patients to the highest possible level. By the August 1960 edition, they'd listed 10 patients as colorists who hand-coloured each front cover. By the look of that illustration, they used coloured pencils, and I would say a very laborious and time-consuming activity. The actual contents of each magazine contain notices of various social events for patients, including fortnightly dances, film nights, library books provided by the Red Cross, an annual Christmas party, annual patients' picnic, church services, cricket matches, and a fancy dress ball. The title of the magazine, The Open Door, represents the open door policy, where some patients could walk to the township of Beechworth and attend outings outside the hospital. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'll finish up there and hand back to Eileen.
Thank you, Alison. It's really fascinating to think about how the times have changed from the first people in the 1867 through to the open door policy that allowed patients to be treated as human beings. Anyway, Jenny, I'd like to bring you in now to talk about the exhibition that we have in Albury. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Eileen. I'll just get myself a bit organised. I'm presuming that you can now see my screen. I keep talking to you over there. Okay. So I wanted to be able to walk you through the exhibition, and I could do that, but it might be a bit lumpy or clumpy with a computer. So I thought that I would take some photographs and show you the way through the exhibition. So we've called it Collections from the Asylum, and we've also adopted the subtitle from the WAM festival, the Right Around the Murray Festival. So past lives, present tense is one of the themes for Right Around the Murray Festival, and I think that that fits our topic and our exhibition quite well. So I wanted to say that we have a wonderful relationship with the Albury Library Museum, which is where the exhibition is being held. We had an exhibition in 2016 called Up Top, which is the colloquial name for the asylum. People talked about working up top or going up top. This is the notification for the exhibition that we're on now. It started on the 5th of September. We had an opening, and it will be in the Library Museum until the 29th of November. And I just wanted to say that it looks beautiful. So if you are a New South Wales person, please take the chance to visit if you can. Unfortunately for Victorian people, which is where Beechworth, of course, is based, our colleague and the curator of the exhibition, Emma Williams, who is in the room, thank you very much, Emma, is working on getting a virtual tour of the exhibition. So in the coming weeks, it might be possible for people in other states of Australia to virtually visit the exhibition, but we'd still like people to come if they can. So I'm going to start if you come to visit, you might go to the Youth Cafe, and I'm starting from that end because I think our most beautiful item in the exhibition I'm going to leave till last as a treat. But the reason that it was called Collections from the Asylum is that we have got collections from different people. So to begin with, if we're walking along the corridor of the exhibition, the first collection is from the Mayday Hills Art Society. So this is a group that have inhabited one of the former female wards on the grounds of Mayday Hills, and they have artist studios, and they run workshops and competitions and events. And they also have a small archive of items. So it's very difficult. There's not one place for archives of Mayday Hills. We've had to search around different museums and collections to find these things. But the Mayday Hills Art Society has started to collect a few photographs and items that are of interest. And if you go to visit them, you're allowed to have a look at their archive. These are, I know my photographs aren't fabulous, but these are on the walls in the exhibition. And I just wanted to say something about the top item there. This is a reproduction of a postcard. So postcards are featured very prominently in some of the images that we've found from the asylum. And they certainly have fascinated me particularly. The next item along the wall is one of Frank Prem's poems. And last year in the Right Around the Murray Festival, Frank Prem was a guest, and he presented some of his poems. But since that time, he has published another collection of poems called The New Asylum. And Frank has been one of our participants. We interviewed him. He has worked as a psychiatric nurse at the hospital, and the poems are quite touching. We also included some of his poems in the opening of the exhibition read by Ben Tari. So we're hoping that that recording is available for people to have a look at. Then next along we have the series of stories by the five diggers, or about the five diggers that Eileen referred to. And that's been a fantastic piece of research that Eileen's done with Rob Scott from the cemetery to get what were previously unmarked graves in the Beechworth Cemetery noted and given plaques by the Department of Veterans Affairs. So the five diggers' stories are on display there with an image of the plaque that marks their grave in the cemetery. And just round the corner, we have the launch of our virtual tours. So if you're able to come to the exhibition, you can take a virtual tour. So these websites are 3D images where you can sort of fly into the grounds of Mayday Hills or the cemetery and scoot around there to see what's available. And the five diggers sites are noted in the virtual tour of the Beechworth Cemetery. We intend to deepen these websites. They're basically in draft form at the moment because of COVID. We had hoped to have more stuff in the websites, but we can't travel to get more information to put into the websites at the moment. So watch this space. Those websites will be available online, and we intend to put more information about Mayday Hills and the Beechworth Cemetery. It hopefully will be what we make into a virtual museum in the future. And I just would mention Dudley Tong too. He was the first digger that we knew about Dudley because a lot of our participants talked about him. And Eileen wrote a lovely monologue that was performed by Ben Tari in the opening. So I hope you can get to see that. Here are the things that Alison contributed. So when Alison joined the team, it was really very interesting to find out about her family history and that she'd done her doctoral study, you know, looking at female patients and particularly her grandmother's story. So this has been beautifully exhibited. Emma Williams has done a really lovely job of putting the information on these panels and showing the images that we've borrowed from Karen. And here are how the glass figures that Alison referred to, how they're displayed. We have this lovely glass cabinet and these beautiful little figures. So these have never been seen in public before. It's quite a delightful thing that we've been able to bring several items to the public that have not been seen before. Another loan from Karen is this very interesting image, coloured photograph of the administration building at Mayday Hills. And Jackie Schultz, who did the video vignettes for our opening, used this to great advantage, I think, when Ben Tari was reading some of the poetry and some of the items in our opening. Here are some of the photographs from the Donnan family exhibited, as Alison described, and again, beautifully displayed by Emma Williams. We have a few images from the Burke Museum collection. So these aren't on display in the Burke Museum. We came across these when we had a period of data collection in Beechworth and went to visit the Burke Museum. And Alison did make sure she got copies of some of the items that the Burke Museum hold so that we could show them in this exhibition. And there is the copy of The Open Door that was loaned to us by the Burke Museum. This was in the collection of Doug Craig, who's a former manager at Mayday Hills and has been a very wonderful participant in our research. We've interviewed he and his wife Val several times. There's a very nice representation of the open door and a good explanation of the beautiful covers that, as Alison said, were hand coloured by the patients. And there is a textiles collection. So I'm an arts-based researcher, so my contribution, apart from being fascinated by Mayday Hills and the people's stories that we have as our participants, have made me want to create artworks to respond to some of the things that we hear the patients, well, what we hear from the patients when we read about them, or we hear from their families, or from our participants who've been workers or in the administration of Mayday Hills. And in the last exhibition, I created some postcards from the asylum, and I wanted to do the same again. And I've responded to the beautiful piece of embroidery that I'll show you in a moment. But these postcards have been created for this exhibition. They're cyanotypes and embroidery, and you can see on the left there that we've printed some, so that if you do come to the exhibition, please take a copy as a small gift from us for coming to visit. I've also created some pillowcases. So in the last exhibition, we borrowed a pillowcase from the Melbourne Museum that was made at Mayday Hills. So occupational therapy at Mayday Hills for women was often sewing, and so the bedding, the sheets and pillowcases were created by patients at Mayday Hills. And so in the last exhibition, I made some pillowcases, and a person that, one of our participants took me to task a little bit by, for calling it mad washing. So with the cyanotypes and embroidery, I've changed the name to sad washing. I think the cyanotypes help me get across that feeling of despair and maybe some lives wasted, perhaps. Anyway, that's them. But here is, I think, our crowning joy in the exhibition. This is one of 4 items that we have on loan from the Dax Centre. So Alison talked to you about the enlightened view of Dr. Dax, who changed the ways that patients were viewed at the asylum, and he encouraged art in the patients to engage themselves in art making. And this particular patient made embroidered several items, and they're just phenomenal. And this is the only one that's up at the moment, but we do have 3 more that Emma is going to put in glass cases. So when you actually come into the library museum, you'll be drawn to these. You know, you can't help it. They're just fabulous artworks, and, you know, yes, made by a patient at Mayday Hills. And so finally, what I wanted to just say was that we do have a space there where if you have any, you come to visit the exhibition, if you have any memories, connections, or if you want to participate in our research, we'd love to hear from you. And so some of the postcards from the last exhibition are sitting there waiting to have stories written on them, and you can post them to us in that little box. We won't be looking at them until the end of the exhibition, so there's no chance of anyone contracting COVID, and there's lots of hand sanitizer around in the exhibition as well, and has made sure of that. And we've got this, the recording of the pieces from the opening. So Jackie Schultz, video vignettes of Ben Tari reading works from Frank Prem, James Dunk, some of the works of the research team, and other items. And it was a really delightful opening, and Ben and Jackie have done a beautiful job of bringing those works to life. So here are the contact details of the research team. And I see that Elizabeth Wolf has joined us. I haven't got Elizabeth's name on the list, but recently Elizabeth has been working with us with some funding proposals, and we hope to secure some funding in the future where Elizabeth will join the team. She is a research officer, and we've been delighted to have her on the team. She's worked really well with us. So her email isn't there, but welcome, Elizabeth, and thanks very much for the work that you've done. And that's me. I can stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
So we do have some notices in the chat box. Just lots of things, absolutely exquisite, beautiful pillowcases were really interesting too. Well, thanks, Alison. It's always a bit funny when you're the arts-based researcher to create artworks. You know, it feels a bit funny, but they're a response to our research.
I hadn't seen them, Jenny, so, you know, I think they look terrific. Yeah.
Well, you will, though. And particularly when we get the, you know, I do hope you'll be travelling down to, because you live in New South Wales, you might
I can get that.
Be allowed to travel, yes. And I think it would be lovely for you to see the way it has been set out in the Library Museum's website.
It looks amazing.
Very engaging.
And hopefully our Victorian friends can get there one day too.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Jenny and Alison. I'd like to ask our audience, our guests, if you've got any questions or any comments that you'd like to pass on to the panel. If you could put them, just type them into the chat box and we'll be able to see them and we'll try and answer them. Alison, I can see there's one there asking whether Curran's figurines were made by patients.
Right. I don't believe they were. I just think they were childhood gifts given from Cunningham Dax, the head of the mental authority, to Karen, who grew up with her father, Dr. Donnan, on the asylum grounds. So no, not made by patients, but quite, you know, I thought an interesting story about what kind of man Cunningham Dax was. Obviously good with children and knew what would delight them, I guess. Yeah.
Emma Williams says some of the ornaments have made in China or made in Japan markings on them. So I guess they were gifts.
They were gifts, yeah, childhood gifts.
And Karen herself has answered, yes, Dr. Dax brought the ceramic animals as gifts for myself and my sister. And, you know, I think it's those sorts of personal stories that we love to hear about, and you know, we'd like to include eventually in the website that we're creating, so that, you know, maybe you'll be able to take a virtual tour inside Mayday Hills, and Karen, along with all of Karen's animals, along with a whole lot of other interesting items and interesting stories, will be available on those websites.
I see we've got a question from Emma Williams wanting to know where to next for the research team. Well, who knows? We've still got a lot of data that we've collected, interviews and things like that we've got to go through and write some academic papers about, probably. We're looking at different ways to present our work to the public so that they can see it. I think we all believe it's really important that the people who have spoken to us and spent time with us get an opportunity through, whether it's the virtual tour or the exhibition or whatever, to see what we made of their findings. And yes, I think we could be busy for quite some time yet.
I think it's a lifetime's work, actually, because there's so many threads, and you know, we follow some threads and we follow don't follow others, we put them on the back burner. But we have a good list of people that we haven't interviewed yet, but we really need to get to. Karen asks, do you know where I can get a copy of Frank Prem's book of poetry? I'd love to read the poems. They're fabulous poems, Karen. And if you just Google Frank Prem and poetry, you'll get to his website, and that's where you, I think that leads you to Amazon, and you can order a copy from there. Emma says, I like how this project is a nice intersection of history, heritage, museum practice, storytelling, community, and academia. And virtual arts. Okay, thanks, Emma. You know, she really has done a fabulous job of exhibiting. I can't wait for many more people to go visit the Albury Library Museum and see how gorgeous it looks.
Yeah. I was just going to add, if anyone has got their own stories of Beechworth, we'd love to hear from you. Jenny did put our emails up, but if you know, we've got a few, what are we running till 6 tonight? Just wondered, you know, if people have got any questions or they want to tell us a bit about themselves and their interest, you can use the chat box.
Perhaps I might just follow up on that, Alison, that we had an email from someone who attended on Wednesday to the opening, a person that we didn't have on our list to be interviewed, but who let us know that he was aware of ghost stories. He was a psychiatric nurse at Mayday Hills who knew Dudley. So we haven't been able to find a lot of people who knew Dudley Tong, but he said he knew him quite well. So that's what we need. We really need to fill in some of the gaps, embellish some of the things that we know already.
That's great. And I guess the more we talk about what we're doing, the more kind of connections, you know, we're making with people and connecting with their interests.
And Karen, I think if that's, I'd love to have your ghost.
That's right.
That's the one about when you're playing the piano, I hope. I love that. That would be just wonderful. And I think it would be nice to have sort of true ghost stories, you know what I mean, which are mainly about the feelings people have about the space, rather than the exaggerated ones that we hear from the asylum tours. We've had a lot of disparaging comments from our participants about the stories that get told in the asylum tours, but at least, you know, the people there are still showing people around the asylum, which is very nice. Marie May says, it was a very happy time as a child going to F10 for morning tea, accompanying my mum, who was the secretary to the superintendent in the 50s and 60s. Marie, I think we need to talk to you.
Yeah, that's a great story, Marie.
Yes.
Yeah,
can we contact you?
So I hope you took note of our email addresses. I might just pop mine in here again so that you can see it.
Which superintendent, Marie, if I may ask? Under which superintendent your mum was secretary for?
Marie, would you like to talk out loud? I'll unmute you.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So Karen says it must have been Dad, Dr. Donnan.
Maybe.
Marie may not have may not have a microphone.
Great information, though. Good connections, hey. So F10 was the female ward. Yeah, secretary.
No, I can't seem to get Marie.
Keep in touch, Marie. I like those stories. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, and Karen says, I would love to chat to Marie as well. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Marie,
Afternoon films.
oh, go on, you read that, Alison.
Oh, the afternoon films in the hall were wonderful, and staff would hand out Dixie ice creams. Ah, wonderful days. Yeah. Yes, apparently there was films shown quite a lot in the theatre, Bijou Theatre. Yeah. Another kind of entertainment for not just patients, hey, just, you know, all welcome by the sounds of it. Well, thanks, Marie. As a parent, we had Sylvia, one of the residents, come to our home and share her friendship with our daughters. Oh, lovely. There's some great stories there, Marie. Oh, excellent. See, the more we get the research out, the more kind of, you know, kind of encouragement people have to share with us, which would be awesome. It's a common place to have residents come to our home as mum always welcomed. Isn't that wonderful? So that's sort of like, you know, the kind of an expansion on that open door policy where, you know, there was sort of that move in and out of the institution with the community, which is quite amazing. Yeah.
And we have
great stories.
We have been told by many of our participants about the characters, you know, so because they were able to go down to the town of Beechworth, you know, some of them were well known in the streets of Beechworth. And Karen says some of the patients would attend the local cinema in town for the Saturday matinees. Just shows such a...
Beechworth had a cinema.
Would that have been in the hall? Marie has continued, the Jackson family lived on the property and were in charge of the vegetable garden, and we would share happy times with family and residents. So
great community, wasn't it? It wasn't just a hospital.
Yes.
But it now going into an oral history project. I guess that's
right.
One of the ideas we've got that we're working on, isn't it, Jenny?
Yes.
Yes.
So we're hoping that the virtual tours will become sort of like a receptacle for a number of different sorts of our research, including some narratives. So yes, we have some wonderful interview transcripts from some of our participants that, you know, we'd like to be able to share. Absolutely.
Marie says the residents loved attending local football and were enthusiastic supporters of the Bombers. Great. Because we've certainly got, this is really great information. We've certainly got a bit of information in the patient magazine and also photographs about the cricket team and cricket practice. So that was kind of, you know, we had an understanding that was popular. But of course, local football as well.
And I didn't show those, but we do have from the Mayday Hills Art Society collection, there are a couple of sports teams photos up on the wall in the exhibition.
Yeah, unreal. And I think Karen told me once she used to go horse riding at the matron's property at Yakandanda. So, you know, there was lots of, you know, really good connections between staff and families and patients. Thanks, Karen. Yeah. Yes. So when we're asked where to next, it's like, well, we need to, you know, we've got quite a few interviews up our sleeve, completed and transcribed, and more to do. So we sort of need to turn those into something, you know, like a oral history project, get those stories out and written up and so forth. So yeah.
We also have just been lucky enough to get a small grant from Prov to
Yes.
put some interpretation and some QR codes at both the cemetery and Mayday Hills that will link to our virtual tours, so that if you go for a physical tour to Beechworth, then you can take your phone and you might be on looking at those diggers' sites, for instance, and you'll be able to go straight to the information that Eileen has dug up about each of those past residents of Mayday Hills.
Marie goes on to say the male staff wore grey ties with green or blue stripes, indicating their seniority. Wow. Okay. Male staff. Mm.
So we'll definitely be keeping the text from the chat room. Don't worry, we'll be.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marie. It's very interesting.
It's fascinating.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and in many ways, oral history and people's, you know, memories is so important because it gives paints a real picture of, you know, the hospital as a community, I suppose. And I describe them as unofficial histories because, you know, there's government reports and all sorts of things about Beechworth that kind of just report, you know, numbers and procedures and things. But, you know, these personal stories are far more engaging, far more fascinating than kind of official history, so to speak. So yeah, terrific.
Okay, well, we're just coming up to 6 o'clock when we have to close the link. I'd like to thank Jenny and Alison for their contributions, and particularly I'd like to thank all of our guests for their interesting discussion, their reminiscences, and helping to build yet a bigger picture of what life at Mayday Hills was like. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll close off the recording and the link now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.